In 1813, the United States government was technically bankrupt. The War of 1812 against Britain had drained the treasury. Congress couldn't pay soldiers. Suppliers refused credit. And every major bank in America, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, refused to lend money to a government that might not exist in 6 months. One man stepped forward, a French immigrant merchant, blind in one eye, friendless, hated across Philadelphia for his coldness and refusal to help individuals in need. Stephen Girard announced he would personally finance the American government's debt, not from patriotism, not from charity, but because he calculated that America collapsing would be worse for business than America surviving. Between 1813 and 1815, Girard used his personal fortune to buy government bonds no one else would touch. He guaranteed loans that kept the war machine functioning. When the official banking system had abandoned the government, Girard's private bank became a lifeline that prevented total financial collapse. After the war ended, America didn't thank him. The public barely knew what he'd done. Politicians took credit for victory without mentioning the merchant who'd paid for it. Girard remained what he'd always been, wealthy, isolated, and despised for his refusal to pretend warmth he didn't feel. He passed away in 1831, alone in his Philadelphia mansion, leaving behind a fortune so vast it funded the creation of Girard College, an institution that still operates today. But the nation he'd saved forgot him almost immediately. This is the story of Stephen Girard, the man who proved that the coldest heart can save the warmest cause, and that nations remember soldiers but forget the bankers who financed them. Before Stephen Girard, the concept of an individual financing a nation's survival was almost unthinkable. Governments borrowed from banks, from consortiums, from foreign powers. They didn't depend on single private citizens whose personal wealth determined whether the nation continued to exist. But Girard wasn't a typical banker. He was a merchant who built a shipping empire and accumulated wealth that rivaled entire state treasuries. And when the War of 1812 pushed America to the brink of financial collapse, he became the only person with both the resources and the willingness to intervene. If you're seeing how one man's cold calculations save a nation that never loved him, hit that like button. And if you want to follow the complete story of how personal sacrifice and national ingratitude intersect, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We're revealing forgotten financiers who built nations. Born in Bordeaux, France in 1750, Stephen Girard went to sea as a young man, working as a merchant sailor and trader. An accident in his youth left him blind in his right eye, a disfigurement that contributed to his lifelong social isolation. He arrived in Philadelphia in 1776, just as the American Revolution was beginning, and saw opportunity in the chaos. Girard built his fortune through shipping and trade during and after the Revolution. He understood credit and maritime commerce, and how to navigate the uncertain politics of a young nation. In 1811, when Congress short-sightedly refused to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States, Girard didn't wait for a solution. He simply bought the entire bank infrastructure, the building, the cash reserves, the assets, and reopened it as Stephen Girard's bank. He didn't ask for permission from the young nation. He became its financial backbone. And the wealthiest individual in the country. The pattern Girard exemplified, where financial survival depends on individuals rather than institutions, still operates in crisis economies today. Let's explore how a cold, friendless immigrant became the only person willing to save America when it needed saving most. Stephen Girard was not beloved in Philadelphia. He was wealthy, by 1810, likely the richest man in America. He owned ships, warehouses, a bank. He lent money at rates that reflected risk accurately, without sentiment. He paid employees fairly, but expected absolute efficiency. He had no close friends, no social circle, no charm. The disfigurement, blindness in his right eye from a childhood accident, made him visually striking in an era when physical appearance carried social meaning. But it was his personality, not his appearance, that isolated him. Girard simply didn't care about being liked. When individuals approached him for loans based on sympathy, hardship stories, family emergencies, personal tragedies, he evaluated purely on ability to repay. If the numbers didn't work, he refused. This made him hated by those he turned away and distrusted by those who couldn't understand wealth without warmth. Philadelphia society gossiped about him constantly. He was foreign. He was unsociable. He was cold. He didn't attend churches or social events. He didn't marry into prominent families or cultivate political connections. He simply accumulated wealth and managed it with ruthless efficiency. In 1793, a devastating yellow fever epidemic struck Philadelphia. As the government and the wealthy fled the city in terror, Girard stayed behind. He didn't just donate money. He personally took over the management of the chaotic Bush Hill Hospital. For months, the richest man in America was seen changing bedsheets, cleaning filth, and carrying dying patients. He didn't do it out of emotional sympathy. He despised sentimentality. He did it because he calculated that for his empire to survive, the city housing had to function. It was the ultimate demonstration of his code, duty over warmth. But Girard understood something most of his contemporaries didn't: solvency. While other merchants and bankers operated on credit networks built partly on personal relationships and partly on optimism, Girard operated on mathematics. He knew exactly what he owned, what he owed, and what his assets could support. This made him conservative in normal times, refusing speculative ventures that promised high returns but carried significant risk. But it also made him uniquely positioned when crisis arrived. Because while others scrambled to call in debts and liquidate positions, Girard had the reserves and the clarity to act. The crisis arrived in 1812. America declared war on Britain, ostensibly over maritime rights and British support for Native American resistance to American expansion. But the underlying cause was economic and political tension that had been building since the Revolution. The problem was that America in 1812 wasn't prepared for war. The first Bank of the United States, which had provided federal financial coordination, had been allowed to expire in 1811. State banks operated independently with no central coordination. The federal government had no reliable revenue source and no institutional mechanism for raising large sums quickly. Girard watched the war's financial impact with cold assessment. Government bonds, the primary method for financing the war, weren't selling. Banks were reluctant to invest in securities that might become worthless if America lost. Individual investors didn't have sufficient capital. Foreign creditors were unavailable since Britain, and its allies obviously wouldn't finance their enemy. By late 1813, the United States government was essentially bankrupt. Congress couldn't pay soldiers. Suppliers were refusing credit. State militias were disbanding for lack of resources. The war was being lost not on battlefields, but in ledgers. And Stephen Girard, the cold, friendless immigrant, was the only person in America with both the wealth and the willingness to do what came next. The War of 1812 exposed every structural weakness in early American finance. Without a central bank, there was no coordination between state banks. Each operated with its own reserve ratios, lending standards and risk tolerance. When the federal government needed money, it had to negotiate with dozens of institutions independently. Most refused. The risks were obvious. If Britain won, or if the war simply dragged on inconclusively, Government bonds would be worthless. Banks that had invested heavily would fail. Shareholders would lose everything. By 1813, the situation was desperate. Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin and his successor George Campbell tried every conventional approach. They increased bond interest rates to make them more attractive. They sent agents to negotiate with banks in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. They approached wealthy individuals. Almost everyone declined. The mathematics didn't work. The United States government had approximately $5 million in annual revenue, but was spending over $30 million on the war. The deficit was unsustainable. Any rational lender saw a default as likely. The consequences of financial collapse were immediate and visible. American forces on the Canadian border were undersupplied. The British blockade of American ports was devastating commerce, reducing government customs revenue, the primary federal income source. Washington, D.C. itself was captured and burned by British forces in August 1814, humiliating the young nation. Peace negotiations again were underway, but Britain had no incentive to offer favorable terms to an enemy that appeared to be collapsing financially even as they held militarily. America needed money. Immediately, in quantities no conventional institution would provide. This was when Stephen Girard calculated that intervention made sense. Not because he loved America, though he'd lived there for nearly 40 years. Not because he was patriotic, though he'd prospered under American commercial freedom. But because he assessed that an American collapse would be worse for his business interests than an American survival, even if that survival came at significant cost to him personally. Girard owned ships, warehouses, and extensive trade networks. An American defeat would likely mean British commercial dominance of North American trade, restrictive navigation laws, and possible confiscation of his assets as a foreign national who'd supported the enemy. The calculation was cold, but it was also clear. In late 1813, Girard approached the Treasury with an ultimatum. The government had tried to raise $16 million through bonds, but had failed catastrophically, securing less than $6 million. The nation was $10 million short of survival. Girard, coordinating with John Jacob Astor and David Parrish, stepped into the breach. But it was Girard's private bank that absorbed the massive lion's share of the debt, personally writing a check that represented nearly 80% of his entire net worth to buy bonds no one else would touch. Between 1813 and 1815, Stephen Girard became the United States government's primary creditor. He purchased approximately $9 million in government securities, an enormous sum representing a substantial portion of his total wealth. He coordinated additional millions through Astor and Parrish. He personally guaranteed loans that kept military operations functioning. When official banking had abandoned the government, Girard's private bank became the lifeline. Without Stephen Girard, the War of 1812 likely ends with American financial collapse, forcing acceptance of humiliating peace terms, possibly including territorial concessions or restrictions on sovereignty. With Girard, America maintained enough financial function to reach the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814 on terms that preserved American independence and territorial integrity. He didn't win the war. Soldiers did that. But he financed their ability to fight long enough to not lose. Girard's intervention was systematic and calculating, not impulsive or emotional. He analyzed the government's cash flow needs. He coordinated with Treasury officials to time bond purchases to match expenditure schedules. He used his knowledge of maritime commerce to advise on customs revenue projections. He operated not as a patriotic volunteer, but as a professional financier managing a risky but potentially profitable investment. The risk was real. If America lost the war or collapsed financially before peace, Girard would lose millions. His wealth would be devastated. His bank might fail. But Girard had assessed that the probability of total loss was lower than the probability of eventual repayment. America had resources, Land, population, commercial potential. The war was draining, but not existentially threatening if financial panic could be prevented. British forces were stretched globally. European politics post-Napoleon made a long American occupation unlikely. The mathematics suggested that America would survive if it could maintain financial function through 1814. And Girard had the resources to provide that function. So he did. Not because he was generous. Because he was rational. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December 1814, officially ending the war. News traveled slowly. The Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson's famous victory, occurred in January 1815, weeks after peace was signed, but before anyone in America knew. That victory, though militarily unnecessary, had enormous psychological and political impact. America celebrated. Jackson became a national hero. Politicians who'd supported the war took credit for successful resistance to British aggression. The war was reframed as a triumph of American determination. Stephen Girard wasn't mentioned in the celebrations. The government eventually repaid Girard with interest. His bonds were honored. His bank received full payment. Financially, the intervention was successful. He recovered his investment and profited modestly. The United States survived, commerce resumed, and Girard's business interests prospered in the post-war boom. But there was no public recognition, no ceremony, no honor. The role he'd played in preventing financial collapse was understood by Treasury officials and a few politicians, but not communicated to the public. America remembered Jackson's victory. It remembered heroic naval battles. It remembered the Star-Spangled Banner written during the bombardment of Fort McHenry. It didn't remember the cold immigrant banker who'd kept the government solvent enough to fight. Girard didn't seek recognition. It's unclear he even wanted it. He continued operating his bank and shipping business. He remained isolated, friendless, and disliked by Philadelphia society. He gave nothing to popular causes that might have rehabilitated his public image. He refused to join social clubs or political movements. He was exactly what he'd always been, wealthy, efficient, and emotionally inaccessible. The difference was that now he was also the man who'd saved America. And nobody knew, or more accurately, nobody cared. Stephen Girard lived 16 more years after the war, becoming even wealthier as American commerce expanded. His bank, Stephen Girard's bank, operating from the building that had housed the first Bank of the United States, was one of the most stable financial institutions in America. He made sound loans, maintained high reserves, and operated with the same cold efficiency that always characterized him. He was still hated, perhaps more than before, because his wealth had grown even more conspicuous. While many Americans struggled in post-war economic adjustments, Philadelphia society gossiped about his isolation with mixture of pity and satisfaction. He lived alone in his mansion, except for servants. He had no family by choice. He'd separated from his wife decades earlier and never remarried. He attended no social events. He had no protégés or close associates. The blindness in his right eye, now more pronounced in old age, made him even more visually distinctive. People whispered that his disfigurement reflected inner coldness. That a man so wealthy should have been generous, warm, beloved. The fact that he'd personally financed the government during crisis was either unknown to most or dismissed as self-interested business, not patriotism. Girard spent his final years methodically planning his legacy. He couldn't give his wealth to family he didn't have or friends he'd never cultivated. So he decided to give it to Philadelphia, not out of affection for the city that had never loved him, but as a final calculation. Wealth should be productive and education productive investment. He wrote a will establishing Girard College, a school for poor white male orphans, reflecting the prejudices of his era. The endowment was massive, ensuring the institution would operate in perpetuity. It was not charity in the emotional sense. It was engineered social benefit, designed with the same cold efficiency he'd applied to banking. Stephen Girard passed away on December 26, 1831, at age 81. He was alone when he left this world. No family gathered. No friends mourned. The funeral was attended by business associates and civic officials performing duty, not expressing grief. The newspapers noted his passing with factual obituaries that focused on his wealth and the provisions of his will. Some mention his role in the War of 1812 financing, but briefly, without emphasis. America had forgotten. Or perhaps it had never really known. The pattern Girard exemplified was already visible in American public memory. Robert Morris, who financed the Revolutionary War with personal credit, had passed away in 1806 after years in debtor's prison, largely forgotten. Haym Salomon, who'd also financed the revolution, had passed away in poverty in 1785, unrecognized. America remembered Washington, Jefferson, Franklin. It built monuments to generals and statesmen. It forgot the financiers who'd made their victories possible. Girard became another name on that forgotten list, wealthy beyond measure, essential to survival, and completely absent from national memory. The nation he'd saved moved on without him. Girard College opened in 1848, 17 years after Stephen Girard's passing. The institution he'd endowed became one of the finest educational facilities in America. It operated exactly as it was specified, providing education and housing to orphan boys who otherwise would have had no opportunity. The building itself was magnificent. Greek Revival architecture, funded by Girard's fortune, designed to last centuries. It still operates today, though now as a private school open to all students regardless of background. It's the only monument Stephen Girard has, and most people who see it don't know who he was. The broader legacy is invisible but fundamental. Girard proved that in extremis, nations can depend on individuals rather than institutions. That when official systems fail, private wealth can substitute for public credit. That one person's calculated self-interest can align with national survival. This wasn't necessarily healthy for democratic governance. It meant that America's survival had depended on whether one immigrant merchant decided intervention was profitable enough to justify the risk. If Girard had calculated differently, the War of 1812 might have ended in humiliating surrender. America might have survived, but as something diminished, the pattern has repeated. During the Panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan personally organized bank bailouts because the federal government couldn't. His intervention prevented total financial collapse. During the 2008 crisis, while government action was ultimately decisive, initial stabilization depended on private institutions making coordinated decisions to prevent cascade failures. Girard's model, private wealth substituting for public capacity in crisis, remains relevant and remains uncomfortable because it means democratic nations sometimes survive because individuals with no accountability to voters decide it's in their interest for the nation to continue existing. This pattern of public reliance on private calculation didn't end in the 19th century. Stephen Girard was a spiritual predecessor of Jamie Dimon, the titan behind J.P. Morgan Chase. During the financial collapse of 2008, and again during the banking crisis of 2023, the United States government didn't look to its own institutions first. It looked to Dimon to absorb failing banks, like Bear Stearns and First Republic. When modern critics ask if these billionaires act out of patriotism or profit, they miss the cold math that Girard mastered. When you are the richest player in the room, saving the system isn't charity. It's the only way to protect your own ledger. Stephen Girard proved something else, perhaps more disturbing. Nations don't remember financial saviors the way they remember military heroes. Andrew Jackson became president based partly on his War of 1812 fame. Streets, cities, and monuments bear his name. Histories celebrate his leadership. Girard, without whom the war would have been lost financially before Jackson could win it militarily, has a college most Americans have never heard of. This reflects how societies construct heroism. Military action is visible, dramatic, easily narrativized. Financial intervention is technical, difficult to explain, and uncomfortable to celebrate because it acknowledges dependence on wealth. The coldness that made Girard hated during his life also made his legacy easier to forget. He never gave society what it wanted: warmth, charm, the appearance of caring about individuals. He gave it what it needed: solvency, credit, survival. But societies don't love what they need. They love what they want. If Girard had been charismatic, if he cultivated public image, if he framed his intervention as patriotic rather than practical, he might be remembered differently. But that would have required him to be someone he wasn't. He chose to be useful rather than beloved, and history forgot him for it. Stephen Girard demonstrated the price of being indispensable without being lovable. He saved America not through sacrifice, but through calculation, not from love, but from analysis. He was exactly what the nation needed in 1813. Someone with resources and willingness to deploy them when emotional appeals had failed. But America in 1831, prosperous and confident, didn't want to remember needing a cold, friendless immigrant banker. It wanted to remember heroic generals and patriotic soldiers. So it forgot the man who'd kept them paid. His wealth endures in Girard College. His impact endures in American survival. But the man himself, Stephen Girard, blind in one eye, alone in his mansion, calculating whether saving a nation was profitable enough to justify the risk, disappeared from memory almost before his funeral was over. Nations build monuments to those they love. They operate on credit provided by those they forget. Girard proved you can be both. Simultaneously. Forever. Stephen Girard was the wealthiest man in America. Cold, friendless, blind in one eye, hated by Philadelphia society for refusing to pretend warmth he didn't feel. In 1813, when the United States government was bankrupt and every major bank had refused to lend, Girard calculated that American collapse would harm his business interests more than American survival would cost him. So he used his personal fortune to finance government bonds nobody else would touch. $9 million. Enough to keep the war machine functioning until peace. America won the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson became a hero. Politicians took credit. Stephen Girard remained what he'd always been: wealthy, isolated, and unloved. He passed away in 1831, alone. He left his fortune to create Girard College, which still operates today. The nation he'd saved moved on without remembering him. Robert Morris had financed the Revolution and died in debtor's prison. Haym Salomon had financed the Revolution and died in poverty. Stephen Girard financed survival and died forgotten. America remembers soldiers. It forgets bankers, even the ones who save it.
If you're starting to see why nations remember warriors but forget financiers, subscribe for the rest of this series. Like this if you'd never heard of Stephen Girard, the man who saved America with money nobody wanted. Comment whether modern financial crises still depend on individuals like Girard, or whether institutions have finally replaced the cold calculation of private wealth. Share this with someone who thinks heroism is always visible. Girard proved it's often technical, uncomfortable, and completely forgotten. The ledgers balance, the nations survive, the bankers disappear. But the architecture of national debt that Morris discovered and Girard mastered was about to be codified into a weapon of global power. The chaotic survival of a young republic required something more than desperate loans. It required a master architect. Next episode, we enter the mind of the penniless orphan who built the financial scaffolding of the modern world, fought the presidents, and paid for his vision with his life. The bastard founding father, Alexander Hamilton.